Dr. Andrew Snelling earned his Ph.D. in geology from the University of Sydney in Australia. He has extensive experience in the Australian mining industry and has conducted intensive research on methods used in dating rocks. Dr. Snelling was a key contributor on the Institute for Creation Research's RATE project, which studied radioisotopes and the age of the Earth. He now serves as the Director of Research for Answers in Genesis. In this video, Rock Strata, Fossils, and the Flood, Dr. Snelling examines several compelling evidences for a global catastrophe. The existence of intercontinental sedimentary rock layers and massive fossil graveyards are just a few of the examples he brings to light.
I want to start where we ought to start. Jesus, the Creator, spoke of the days of Noah as a literal historical period in which a real man, Noah, lived. And he spoke of Noah entering the ark and the flood coming and taking them all away as real, literal history in which there was an ark and a life-destroying global flood. Now, if Jesus believed that, then so should you and I. Now, when it comes to looking at the Earth's rock strata and asking about the flood and what the rocks mean in terms of the flood, we have to be honest and say the Earth and its rock strata, the rock layers, only look old because of the way they're interpreted, the assumptions that people use to interpret what we see and measure, how quickly the geological processes occur. And the underlying assumptions that geologists use today, that most people automatically think, is that only present observable geological processes have been operating at the present rates to explain how the rock layers formed. And that's how most people think. When they look at rock layers, they automatically think millions of years because they've been brainwashed into thinking that only present-day processes operating at present-day rates could ever be responsible for all the rock layers. And so it's obvious, isn't it? If you have that assumption, geological processes are so slow today. Of course, there's occasional spurts when you have a local flood or a catastrophe like a hurricane, that if that's the way geological processes have always operated, then, well, it could have taken billions of years to form the Earth's rock layers. But the real question we have to ask ourselves is this: is the present, what we observe in the present, the key to understanding the past? Because that's the underlying assumption in all of modern geology, that the present observable processes explains what happened in the past. You know, Satan is very cunning because he likes to turn things upside down, because the scriptures teach us the other way around. Understanding what happened in the past explains the present. The present is abnormal. It's not the way the Earth was originally created, and it's not the way geological processes have always operated. So is the present is the key to the past? For example, a good question: do we see vast fossil beds forming today? When was the last time you saw on the dead fish on the bottom of the ocean waiting to be fossilised? I mean, I say this to young kids, they can understand it. What happens when a fish dies? Does it sink or float? It floats where it rots. So how do you form a fossil? Good question, I'm glad you asked. So do we see vast fossil beds forming today? The answer is no. Therefore, the present can't be the key to the past. You see, amongst geologists now, even in the conventional scientific community, there's increasing recognition that most fossil beds and most rock layers required catastrophic geological processes to form. And that's what we observe today. You have a hurricane and it forms a layer of sand as a result of washing up onto the land. And therefore, a catastrophic global flood, as we read in the Bible, is a viable explanation for the fossils and the rock layers that we see in the geologic record. The reliable record that God has given us of what happened in the past. God's record of Earth history. And what do we read about the flood? All the fountains of the great deep were broken up. The windows of floodgates of heaven were open. The rain was upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I mean, you only have to have 1 day and night of rainfall and you've got a local flood. Imagine 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rainfall all around the globe. But that wasn't all. Remember the fountains? Those fountains of the great deep broke open first. There was more water that flooded from inside the earth that spurted out and spread over the earth's surface. For 150 days, we're told, the fountains were opened. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole of the heavens and the mountains were covered. Does that sound like a global flood? It reads like it. All flesh that moved upon the earth died, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground. You see, when we read that account, we cannot escape that it had global implications. You know, when many Christians are confronted with a difficult question, they often get embarrassed because they don't have answers. You know the way Jesus often answered a question? He asked a question in return. You know, if someone says to you, there's no evidence for Noah's flood, do you stand there dumbfounded trying to think of what evidence you could give them? Or are you smart enough to say to them, wait a minute, if Noah's flood really occurred, what evidence would you look for? Most Christians haven't thought about that. If Noah's flood really... Remember what it said? All the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered, and the mountains were covered, and all the creatures died. If Noah's flood really occurred, what evidence would you expect to find? Well, you've heard it tonight already, haven't you? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, I want to unpack that for you. Major evidences for the flood. Would we expect that the ocean waters flooded over the continents? Of course, we're told all the high hills under the whole of the heaven were covered in water. We'd expect to find that the animals and plants were rapidly buried. And that's exactly what we find. We'd expect to find, as the waters travelled across the continents, they'd deposit sand and mud right across the continents. So we'd expect to find widespread, rapidly deposited strata. And we'd expect the sand and the mud and the lime to be transported vast, long distances. A global flood would carry sediments globally. And that's exactly what we find. We'd expect to also find that there was rapid or no erosion between the strata. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment. Because you see, the geologists today will tell you that yes, occasionally you'll get a catastrophic event that will produce one rock layer, and a catastrophic event will produce the next rock layer, but there's millions of years in between. What I want to show you is that if the flood really occurred, there wouldn't be millions of years in between. There'd be only evidence of rapid or no erosion, so that it was continuous water deposition of all the rock layers. Well, let's go into this in detail. First of all, the ocean waters flooded over the continents. What evidence would we expect to find of that having occurred? Very simple. We'd expect to find marine fossils in rock layers that cover the mountains. My second son, last October, November, was in Nepal, in the Himalayas. And he brought me back a fossil of a seashell, a sea creature, from the Himalayas. Those mountains were formed by rock layers deposited during the flood. when the waters were over the continents. We'd expect to find rapid burial of creatures and plants, and we do. We find what we call extensive fossil graveyards. Billions of creatures buried together catastrophically and exquisitely preserved. Let me give you some examples. Let's go to the Grand Canyon, which is a textbook, an icon of evolutionary geology, which is one of the reasons why we as creationists have gone to the Grand Canyon to show that the evidence declares Noah's flood. Now, each of these rock layers you see marked there, every one of those rock layers has marine fossils in them. You go to the rim of the Grand Canyon and you have marine fossils. You're over a mile above sea level. The waters flooded over the continents. Let's go halfway down and look at the red wall limestone. Now, geologists give rocks fancy names. Why do you think they call it red wall limestone? Well, it's very easy. It forms a red wall. And so there's the red wall limestone from the rim, and there's the red wall limestone from the Colorado River. Now, inside these limestone, you have these marine fossils. On your left there, you can see a crinoid or sea lily. On the right, you can see a bryozoan or a lace coral. Lots of sea creatures, all buried together, all broken up. They didn't live that way, but they were buried that way. One of the most interesting fossils in the red wall limestone is this creature called a nautiloid. You're all familiar with the modern nautilus, which is a coiled shellfish that has a tube that sucks in water. In fact, you can see that in this critter. In the middle there, you can see the remains of a tube. He sucked in water and squirted it out. It was like a jet engine. In fact, that's where engineers got the idea for a jet engine. Had a head like a squid, and he propelled himself through the water. Well, in the Grand Canyon, we find in this red wall limestone, in one layer within the limestone, billions of these nautiloids. It's about a 7-foot thick layer, and it stretches from one end of the canyon to the other. In fact, you can see it in the suburbs of Las Vegas. This fossil bed, limestone, full of these nautiloid fossils, billions of them. They're in a 2-metre thick bed, all mixed up with crinoids, corals, brachiopods, gastropods, which are marine snails and clams, and these lace corals. The bed covers an area of 30,000 square kilometres. It represents a mass kill and burial event of an entire living population. Within hours, a gravity-driven sediment flow travelling at 5 metres per second. 5 metres per second. It's about 12 miles an hour, 10 to 12 miles per hour. And that whole bed of nautiloids, those nautiloids were buried. It was a living population, all different size nautiloids, all buried together, and many of their shells are facing in the same direction. They were all travelling with the water currents, and they were overwhelmed. They were nailed by this sediment flow. So that's an example of an extensive fossil graveyard, right there in the middle of the Grand Canyon rock sequence. Other examples, we can go to France and we find hundreds of thousands of marine creatures buried with amphibians, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects and reptiles. Notice that? Marine creatures with spiders. Where do spiders live? Normally on the land. You know, people get this idea that you only find marine fossils in this layer and land creatures in this layer. No, you often find them mixed together. Well, that's not the way they lived, is it? You don't find marine creatures living with spiders up on the land. So we can't say that this is where these creatures live, but what can we say? This is where they're buried, because we find them buried together in these rock layers. They were catastrophically buried by a catastrophe that affected both the land and the ocean at the same time. We go to Colorado, the Florence fossil beds, a wide variety of insects, freshwater mollusks, fish, birds, several hundred plant species. By the way, how long does it take to fossilise a bird? If you don't get him quickly, he just flies away. Again, notice a mixture of different creatures all buried together. And here's some example. Here's a fish from this Colorado fossil bed. A bee. I mean, look at the exquisite detail. You can see the venation in the wings. You have to bury him catastrophically, burying him with birds and blossoms. Exquisite detail. It had to be catastrophic burial and preservation. Another example, in Wyoming, in the Green River Shales, alligator, fish of many varieties, even up to 6 feet long, buried with birds, turtles, mammals, clams, crustaceans, many varieties of insects and palm leaves. Again, a mixture of land and water-dwelling creatures. And one of my favourites from my own country, thousands of marine creatures, corals, lace corals, bryozoans, mollusks or clams, buried with a toothed whale and a marsupial possum in Fossil Bluff on the northwest coast of Tasmania, our island state. And here's Fossil Bluff. It's about 80 feet high, and it's a sandy limestone. And at the base of the cliff we find this jumbled mass of broken clam shells with you can see pebbles in there. And they're all broken up and smashed. In fact, in some places you can see boulders the size of houses and cars. It was catastrophic water action that smashed up all these creatures and buried them together. And here in the museum in Hobart, the capital city of the state, we see the remains of the toothed whale. And here's the remains of the marsupial possum. Now again, think about it, because most people don't think, by the way. Asking intelligent questions. When was the last time you saw a whale and a possum living together? Why do I ask that question? Because conventional geologists look at these fossil beds and interpret